Rules Committee come to order, and good afternoon, and welcome back to the Rules Committee. Today we'll be considering H.R. 3053, the Nuclear Waste Policy Amendment of 2018, Amendments Act of 2018. When Congress enacted the Nuclear Power Waste Policy Act of 1982, it formally established a comprehensive nuclear waste management strategy and provided the statutory framework that still governs the setting, construction, and operation of a permanent geologic repository to dispose of spent nuclear fuel and high-level radioactive waste. The NWPA also established a 1998 deadline for the federal government to take title to the spent nuclear fuel for disposal. Because the Department of Energy missed the deadline, American taxpayers are currently liable for over $34 billion in payments to nuclear utilities, which continues to escalate every single year. These payments come from an unlimited account that is not subject to annual appropriations or budget caps. I think it's wasting taxpayer dollars. Spent nuclear fuel currently sits idle in 121 communities across 39 states because the country lacks a permanent geologic repository. After extensive technical analysis that was done by the Department of Energy, the Secretary determined Yucca Mountain was a suitable site for the first deep geologic repository. And after Congress enacted a resolution designated Yucca as the site for the repository, DOE prepared and submitted a license application to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission in 2008. H.R. 3053 amends NWPA to improve the Department of Energy's nuclear waste management program to store and dispose of spent nuclear fuel and high-level radiation waste. More specifically, this legislation assists in the resolution of the pending Yucca Mountain license by allowing the formal licensing process to determine if the repository can be licensed and constructed. It's a big effort, something John Shimkus has been involved in for years and years. That's why he is bringing this legislation before the Rules Committee today. Furthermore, the bill directs DOE to move ahead with a temporary storage program to consolidate spent nuclear fuel from decommissioned reactors across the country while work on Yucca Mountain repository processes moves forward. And that is welcome news to, I think, lots of people who are tired of paying the money and getting nothing tangible in response to that. H.R. 3053 also reforms the broken financing mechanism, costing taxpayers billions of dollars each and every year. The bill protects taxpayers by assuring DOE has adequate funding to construct and operate a multi-generational infrastructure project. So, this issue has been talked about for years, virtually every year I've been in Congress, and I have watched as we have seen states, and in particular the state of Nevada, wrestle with its citizens on this issue. We've taken feedback and continue to take feedback from not only members of that delegation, but also senators from that delegation. So today I would like to welcome the distinguished gentleman from Illinois, the gentleman who is a member of my class, a gentleman who is a United States Army veteran, a gentleman who graduated from West Point, a distinguished gentleman who has served this body and who has served on the Energy and Commerce Committee for years, who has taken this up as a project that he would understand not only the facts of the case, but be able to offer recommendations and alternatives from a policy perspective to the United States Congress. So I am delighted that he is here before us today, and the ranking member As we know, Mr. Tonko, you come to this committee each time with honor and distinction. You do your homework, you're prepared, and I don't really have any clue where you're going to come from today, except I can say this: you're in the right place to do it. This committee is prepared for both of you. This committee is aware of the arguments, and we do know that the state of Nevada struggles in moving forward on answers that would be good for them and their citizens, and we recognize that. But that is why Mr. Shimkus is trying to take us into a direction for resolution. So I'm delighted both of you are here. John, as you know, I have long been a fan of not only your insistence to keep working on this, but also for a resolution that could pass the Congress. Before we get to you, sir, we're going to defer to the ranking member, the gentleman from Massachusetts, for any opening statements. Gentlemen, make the gentleman's recognized.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and you know, I want to welcome our two witnesses. I'm not as enthusiastic about this bill as you are, and I have lots of questions about the safety in transporting nuclear materials all across the country, and but we'll, you know, obviously those issues will be brought out in the debate, and I hope. I know there are a number of amendments that have been offered. I hope that they're all made in order. But I do want to just take a minute, Mr. Chairman, because yesterday at our meeting, we spoke about Agriculture Committee Chairman Mike Conaway's remarks made before the recent district work period. And he had said that if members want to offer amendments to the Farm Bill, which may be up as early as next week, I'm not sure if we have an update on when the Farm Bill might be coming.
The gentleman's asked me a question. I believe that there has been an indication from Republican leadership that there would be filing, an intent to file that and move forward with the bill next week.
Okay.
That'd be correct, sir.
Yeah, so, but, you know, as you know, he said if members want to offer amendments to the Farm Bill, they must first agree to vote for the bill. And as I said yesterday, this would be an extraordinary break from tradition for this committee. Well, we had an exchange yesterday, but I want you to know Chairman Conaway is at it again. A reporter, Matt Fuller from the Huffington Post, just this morning quoted him again pushing for this committee to offer a rule that includes amendments only from Republicans and Democrats who agree to vote for the Farm Bill right now before we even finish the amendment process. I can tell you, I think pretty much every Democrat is going to vote against the Farm Bill, so that means that only Republicans will probably be able to even have their amendments entertained. Chairman Conaway said, and I quote, "It's not a dangerous precedent, it's just common sense." Well, I couldn't disagree more. America is still a democracy, and this Congress should act like it. You wrote in the letter that you sent to us following Chairman Conaway's initial comments that you would, quote, "be facilitating a robust, open debate on the House floor," end quote. That to me means that there should be an open rule for the Farm Bill, but since there hasn't been a single open rule under Speaker Ryan, I'm not going to hold my breath. I know the best we could hope for is a structured rule. So I want to make clear that if we are fortunate, but I want to make clear that if we, Democrats, are fortunate enough to be in charge of this committee someday, I look forward to you continuing to call structured rules a robust, open debate. We will be sure to remind you if you don't. But the precedent of some Trumpian loyalty pledge, as Chairman Conaway keeps suggesting, I think would be very, very dangerous. And it would do a disservice not only to this committee, but to all members of Congress who serve to have our ideas considered. Just because Republican leaders don't like an amendment doesn't mean it is a poison pill designed to bring a bill down. So I'm hoping that you'll make clear here today that you disagree with Chairman Conaway and that this committee will reject any call for a loyalty pledge. And I'll just close by saying this. I mentioned this yesterday. The Agriculture Committee has historically been probably the most bipartisan committee in the Congress. And I've been on that committee for a while. And even when I don't agree with the final product, I've always believed that the process on that committee has integrity. As I mentioned yesterday, Colin Peterson is the ranking Democrat, probably one of the most conservative Democrats around. You can't strike a bipartisan deal with Colin Peterson, forget it. You can't strike a bipartisan deal with anybody. But what happened in the Agriculture Committee on this Farm Bill was unprecedented. language appeared out of thin air on the nutrition title that was not a result of any of the committee hearings, that was not written by anybody in the committee, as far as I can tell. I think it probably was handed to the committee by either the Speaker's office or by the Heritage Foundation or whatever, conservative think tank, is calling the shots these days. But it was not a product of the Agriculture Committee. The process essentially was rigged. And Chairman Peterson made a decision, and all the Democrats agreed that we're not going to that we were not going to offer amendments because we did not want to legitimize an illegitimate process. And I think I'm very concerned that we are approaching that again as the bill goes to the floor. We're not going to legitimize an illegitimate process. And if, the rules have already been written and the die has already been cast, then it is what it is. But I just thought for the record it was important to state that, this represents a terrible breakdown of procedures in this House and a terrible precedent. And I hope that we learn from it and it doesn't happen again. But I feel terrible that it's happening on the Farm Bill, and I just wanted to state for the record my concern because I've really never seen anything like this before. So I appreciate the time, and I yield back my time.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate the gentleman not only taking the attention of the committee, but for his thoughtful ideas. This committee does understand, the Rules Committee, that the gentleman, the ranking member of this committee, sits on the very important Agriculture Committee. The gentleman that we're talking about, Mr. McGovern, has for years taken a strong lead, not only in food stamp issues, but other nutrition issues that are very important to children and families and this great nation. With that same spirit, I would also add that I've known the gentleman, Mr. Michael Conaway, for many years. Mr. Conaway is a very kind and genuine man who comes at this position from a background of being a CPA. He is a very pro-business, thoughtful man who looks at money, cares about conditions in the agriculture community. I will tell you that what Mr. Conaway has expressed to me is nothing but care and concern for decisions that are being made in agriculture, about programs that are in agriculture, with an eye for making sure that it meets the needs of the country. The country should be concerned about children, families, and elderly people and their ability to have food. As you know, Mr. McGovern, I also add in, and those who cannot take care of themselves, who may not be able-bodied. Mr. Conaway, in defense of the conversations that we've had, is aware that there are 11 million American males between the ages of 19 and 49 who are on food stamp programs that do not work. Able-bodied men in this country that do not work and who receive food stamps is a legitimate policy question that would be discussed, perhaps not agreed to. And this is the sort of facts of the case that Mr. Conaway would be expected to bring before the committee. The committee, and I have talked to the members, has not made decisions on any one particular item nor amendment. We are, however, under review of these, and I have been visited by a number of people on a bipartisan basis on these issues. This committee, the Rules Committee, will take input from members. We're open to do business. We're open to amendments that would be presented, and we expect to have the staff and the staff time and the member time that would allow us to appropriately understand, delineate what we believe is good policy and that which would be debated. I would ask, before I enter this into the record, that you just allow me to make one statement from reading from a letter that I have just received dated May the 8th. And it is from Chairman Michael Conaway, Chairman Agriculture Committee, to me. He says, "We greatly respect the work that you and your committee do to provide members of Congress the opportunity to make contributions towards the betterment of legislation through a healthy debate and the offering amendments during the floor consideration. We appreciate your vigilance in distinguishing between those amendments being proposed for the purpose of improving legislation and those that serve as a poison pill to kill the threatening measure." The underlying measure of the Farm Bill, I'm sure, is political. On a political basis, and I'm sure not every Republican and not every Democrat agree equally. What I will tell you is that this committee will make itself available, what I believe is next week, and I want to assure you that I am available to meet with you on every single amendment, that I will make my time available to you, and I would like to hear from you and any committee member on that basis. And that it is important that you do understand that you should encourage any of your members to know that they could perhaps think they might or might not get their amendments made in order, but that this committee will be available, that this committee has strong representatives of a strong, not only moral basis from we believe that people who come up here we agree with and like, but also the standing of members like Mr. Newhouse, who have a deep background in agriculture by virtue of serving as the Secretary of the State of Washington in agriculture. We have other people like Jim McGovern, who has spent years in the committee, who can lend their talents and their attributes. And at no time has this committee ever, since I have been chairman, asked anyone to please not provide positive or negative or feedback to a witness that would enable them to represent themselves. And so I simply want to make sure that I am on record to make sure that this committee will be run in a fair way, and I should be able to have to explain to you, the other committee members, and members of this House of Representatives what we're doing and why that fits within the policy. So without
Mr. Chairman,
exception, I'd like to enter this letter from
I don't want to belabor it, but let me just say
into
two
the
things.
record.
Our concern is that Chairman Conaway made a mockery of the committee process. And that's not my opinion. That's the opinion of every Democrat on that committee, including the ranking member, Mr. Peterson. And I appreciate your assurance that he cares about the people that are affected here, but of those able-bodied adults that you're talking about, and by the way, one of the hearings we wanted was on able-bodied adults. We never were able to get it, but include a lot of veterans who are returning from Iraq and Afghanistan who are having a difficult time reintegrating into our community. And various veterans organizations have come forward and expressed their concern on it. Of those able-bodied adults or people just graduating out of foster care, people with undiagnosed mental illnesses. It doesn't fit into the nice little stereotype of the press release that the chairman has been putting forward. But under this provision that he has put in this bill, millions of people will lose their benefits, and even hundreds of thousands of kids are estimated to lose their access to free breakfast and lunch because they automatically get enrolled in that if their parents are on SNAP. So this whole process has been horrific, and it is indefensible. But I just want you to know the concern we have is when the chairman who oversaw this process, or lack of process, is now publicly telling everybody, and as late as this morning, that we only are interested in making amendments in order for people that will vote for the bill in advance. It raises some concerns. So I just wanted it on the record because, again, I think it is becoming clear to us that with regard to the Farm Bill, the process has been rigged from the beginning. And we just wanted on record that we object to the way this has been handled. And anyway, we look forward to hearing from our two witnesses today.
Yes, I know we do, and I will just say one more thing. We're going to expect to have testimony during this about what able-bodied means. And in my opinion,
The place where that should have occurred was in the Committee of Jurisdiction, the Agriculture Committee, before you draft language, you know, that, by the way, you know, impacts not just able-bodied men who are adults. I mean, this is far-reaching in what it does. But the objection was that none of the language in the Farm Bill on the nutrition title reflects any of the hearings. In fact, if anything, it reflects the opposite of those hearings. So, well, I mean, you could have that conversation with Mr. Conaway. It's kind of too late because this bill is going to go to the floor as is, and my understanding is that he's right now trying to find ways to bring the Freedom Caucus on board, which tells me that they're going to take a bill that I consider mean and make it even meaner. But be that as it may, I think some of the stuff that is happening in this House is destructive. I just hope it's not long-term. And I appreciate your indulgence and look forward to hearing about Yucca Mountain.
yes, sir. And I will now finish my comments that I allowed you to be a part of, and I thank the gentleman very much for this important dialogue. I would say to the gentleman that probably in my reading of the bill, we will not take something away. We will simply add a work requirement, a volunteer requirement, something that would be important for a person who is able-bodied. And I do not believe that we will find out that a person that has returned from the war, that is suffering, that has been diagnosed, I do not consider them an able-bodied adult. And I believe that the medical evidence would suggest that that is not what we're trying to do here.
Well, just to make matters even more concerning, I went through a series of questions in the Agriculture Committee,
Yes, sir.
and the chairman was not able to answer a single one of them.
Well,
nor was his staff.
Well,
All right,
it is
and you know
my
what? And the Rules Committee is not the place for that.
Well.
It should have been done in committee, and that is what we object to.
I don't want to
Yeah.
debate that because I'm not sure I disagree with you.
Yeah.
But I think it resides both places. And so since it does need to reside here, these are questions that I would come up with. For instance, I am very concerned to make sure that women and children, what is the age at which we would look at? How do we deal with disabled people? And these are important questions that I would view would be very appropriate up here. And I could be wrong. Maybe they shouldn't be discussed in the hearing, but I think they should. And so I intend to ask those questions and debate that even more. And I don't want to take this further than the gentleman chooses. I will take it at where we are. And I thank the gentleman very much. Gentleman from Florida.
Thank you very much
Yes,
for
sir.
yielding, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir.
You know, all of us are concerned about children, but yesterday I read that the administration proposes a rescission of $15 billion in the Children's Health Insurance Program. That's very disturbing. But to follow on your point, and perhaps Chairman Conaway's point with reference to able-bodied people, I have always agreed that able-bodied people ought to work. But I go a step further than you all. I think that the government writ large, the United States federal government, the state government, and counties and municipalities have an exacting responsibility to be the employer of last resort. Now, let me give you an example. There's an election ongoing as we speak in West Virginia. Many of the men and women that are on food stamps in West Virginia would like nothing more than to not be on food stamps. When they had coal and all of us directly or indirectly benefited from their mine work, but when they lost their mines, then they don't have any work. And I've been in Appalachia, and I've been in rural communities. I represent a rural community in the Glades. There ain't no jobs there.
Yes.
So you can talk all you want about able-bodied people ought to go to work. The next question becomes where. And with ongoing events in this world today, and with the advent of artificial intelligence, I'm not sure that we're ever going to be able to do anything here by manipulating tax policy that's going to provide jobs. And so I'm not so sure that all of those persons in the cohort that you described, age-wise, are able to go to work because there is no work. That's my point to make to you and Mr. Conaway when he comes up here.
I thank the gentleman very much. It would be my hope that during the vetting process of specific piece parts of the bill, there would be questions and answers that would get us closer to that. And
There should be, if someone chose, an amendment about job training and those kinds of things, if it is that we're going to require people. That's, and Mr. McGovern's point, you really, Mr. Chairman, have not addressed the issue that he raised. All the points that you made are fine, and I believe Jim would agree with them. But the issue you did not address is Chairman Conaway is saying that if you don't vote for the Farm Bill, your amendment shouldn't be made in order. Well, that's not fair.
if
That's
the
what it
gentleman would
boils
yield for
down
just
to.
a second,
Yes, sir.
how would I know when I offer an amendment, accept a person's word of how they're going to vote? And I would just say to the gentleman, as I did yesterday, in fairness, I believe, and I hope I have not been guilty of it. I think over these years that I've been up here, I have been very cognizant of not trying to attempt to take a person's amendment as though they would vote for the bill or not. And I've tried not to, and I know that even in the majority and minority, there's a temptation to want to call somebody's bluff. What I'm suggesting to you is, I think it would be inappropriate. This point that I think Mr. Conaway, if he were trying to make one, is that there are people that want to drive this to a lowest common denominator and then vote no. And why would we want someone that legitimately chose never to be for the bill, but would drive it to where others might find it unaccountable? And so that's really the point if we want to say what I think Mr. Conaway was doing. We could all disagree up here. I'm simply saying that I think that Mr. McGovern is an honest person who has represented himself and his ideas and his consistent behavior. And I would like to say I'm going to stand up for my friend, Michael Conaway, and say that I do not believe he meant it on a necessarily a Democrat or Republican political basis. He said it underneath the term of what might be, I want to drive this thing to the lowest point I can, then vote no.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I just want to say for the record, because you said I was an honest person, honestly, I don't know of a single Democrat that will vote for this bill. So I think we come
You're
into,
presupposing something on your party,
we've had a lot of discussions about this.
and I respect that.
So I'm just saying.
We have,
We think the process was rigged. We think it's a terrible bill. We think millions of people will lose their benefits. We think it will hurt children. We think it will hurt people who are disabled. It will hurt our veterans. We don't want any part of it.
well,
So
I still go to
appreciate
the
it.
theater to watch the show, even though I might not like it.
Thank you.
And I do appreciate the gentleman, and I respect you, but we're not going to sweep this under the rug and act like I can't respond. You've never said that. You wrote me straight up. I wrote you straight back. But Chairman Conaway did also, and I'm going to take his words. So we have entered those in the record, and I want to thank you. Is there any other member that would seek time? Thank you very much. We now move to our panel. Gentlemen, I am delighted that you're here. Please know that each of you, Mr. Shimkus, Mr. Tonko, you bring equally contentious items before this committee today. There are some people that would suggest to us that we're not handling difficult matters. I would offer a different viewpoint, and today we're going to give you a chance to provide your level of detail about your ideas about solving things. I also note we have several members of Congress who've taken their time to be here today also, and I admire each and every one of them, and will publicly tell them that your testimony and that the things that you say before this committee, we're delighted that you're here. And please know that you have come up for the right reason, and this committee is very capable and able to hear you. And I'm delighted that you have taken your time in a busy time to be here with us. Without objection, anything each of you have brought in writing, we have an awesome stenographer here who would appreciate finalizing the record. The gentleman, distinguished gentleman from Illinois, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. McGovern, thank you for having me. Fortunately, the bill that we bring before you today is not as contentious as the one just addressed because we were able to pass it out of the full committee with a 49-4 vote. So I think it shows a level of due diligence that people would respect in the process. Mr. Chairman, over 35 years ago, the United States Congress made a promise to the American people. That promise was that we would not pass along the challenge to manage and dispose of our nation's spent nuclear fuel and nuclear waste to another generation. Yet today, we still have not kept our word, and the consequences are real and tangible. To date, ratepayers have paid the Department of Energy over $40 billion and have nothing to show for it. Communities with shuttered nuclear power plants can't redevelop those sites, depriving them of potential economic opportunity. And American taxpayers are paying millions of dollars every single day because the federal government broke its legal obligation. It is time to fix this policy, and the bill before us today is a critical step in doing so. The Nuclear Waste Policy Amendments Act of 2018 addresses 5 fundamental issues. The first, the bill addresses outstanding requirements to ensure the Nuclear Regulatory Commission completes its review of the pending Yucca Mountain license application. Completion of this license application will provide definitive answers about the project and allow opponents of the repository to have their objections publicly debated and adjudicated and brought to resolution. Second, the bill authorizes DOE to contract with a private entity to temporarily store commercial use fuel at a centralized location. If a private entity successfully receives an NRC license to house the nuclear waste, this path can provide DOE a method to take ownership of the spent nuclear fuel and end the legal payments. Third, the bill fixes the broken financing mechanism. In 1982, Congress set up a fee-for-service model by which ratepayers that benefited from nuclear energy paid for the spent fuel disposal. However, a series of changes in how the federal budget is managed subsequently undermined that model. As a result, the Nuclear Waste Management Program was never implemented as intended. Fourth, the bill requalifies the state of Nevada to negotiate a benefits agreement and allows local governments a separate opportunity to partner with the Department of Energy. The host state and community should be recognized as long-term partners, and I look forward to future conversations to constructively engage with these important stakeholders. Lastly, the bill strengthens DOE's management of the program by providing leadership continuity in the statutorily mandated project office. The Rules Committee print under consideration makes a handful of targeted modifications from the bill as reported by the Energy and Commerce Committee. It clarifies that benefits agreements relating to both interim storage facilities and repository are subject to appropriations, which addresses the Congressional Budget Office's determination that such money could be classified as mandatory spending. The rules print also addresses concerns raised by my colleagues on the Appropriations Committee regarding issues with funding a multi-generation infrastructure project. With the assistance of the House Budget Committee, the rules print guarantees that future ratepayer payments to the Nuclear Waste Fund is only used for the purpose for which the money is collected. This critical reform fixes a broken financing mechanism that plagued the program for the previous 35 years and is central to protecting ratepayer investments for our nuclear waste program. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member McGovern, thank you again for the opportunity to testify. I'll be happy to answer any questions that you have or may have, and I yield back my time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Shimkus, thank you very much. Mr. Tonko, we're delighted that you're here. The distinguished gentleman is recognized. If I could take 1 second first and say, Paul, I don't know if I thanked you, but the members of the committee who attended, Mrs. Slaughter's funeral respected and appreciated not only your words of support for her, but your long-term friendship for a dear colleague who we will miss, and I want to thank you and publicly state that, how much I appreciate and respect you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and to you and Ranking Member McGovern and the entire committee. Let me offer my condolences to this committee, because I know we had in Congresswoman Slaughter a devoted member to this committee. I believe the first female chair of the committee.
That's correct.
And a ranking member and longtime service, and who took this role very, very seriously. And, you know, as you indicated, I'm a frequent visitor before the Rules Committee, but this time there's something very empty.
Yes, sir.
And so we appreciate her service and her friendship, and let's continue to do the right things in her memory.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Thank you.
Okay. Chair Sessions and Ranking Member McGovern, thank you for allowing me to testify this afternoon on H.R. 3053, the Nuclear Waste Policy Amendments Act of 2017. First, let me recognize the hard work done by Chair Shimkus on this bill. He has been tireless in this effort, and I appreciate his and his staff's willingness to work with members of the minority to address a number of our concerns. Throughout this process, numerous Democratic members acknowledged the importance of developing a solution to store spent nuclear fuel, which is currently being stored at shutdown or soon-to-be shutdown reactors. The inventory of spent nuclear fuel in the United States is now over 72,000 metric tons, most of which is stored on site and is expected to grow to 139,000 metric tons by 2067. The issue of nuclear waste at shutdown plants is of great concern to the host communities of these facilities, but it also impacts taxpayers in every congressional district across the country who have paid over $6 billion from the Treasury's Judgment Fund for breach of contracts on the removal of this waste. It has been estimated that taxpayers' liability from this fund may grow to over $30 billion. I will defer to Chair Shimkus on his description of the bill, but I want to take a minute to discuss a number of the issues raised by the minority, which I believe, and they believe, have improved the bill and enabled it to garner strong bipartisan support. First, let me say that many of us, myself included, have not passed judgment on the merits or final disposition of the Yucca Mountain project. That is why the minority worked to remove what we viewed as a number of troubling Nevada-related policies from the bill as introduced. And I thank my colleagues who were very strong in these concerns. This included language that declared the use of water at the Yucca Mountain site to be beneficial and not detrimental to the public interest, overriding the Nevada State Engineer's 2002 decision. We also worked to remove language that would have severely limited Nevada's Clean Air Act authority at the site. I would also like to highlight the minority's work to encourage development of interim storage sites. The bill includes language based upon a proposal developed by Congressmember Doris Matsui to allow the Secretary of Energy to enter into an agreement to establish an interim storage pilot program. I believe the majority and minority disagree on the timeline in which the Yucca permitting applications issues can be adjudicated. Moving forward with interim solutions in the meantime, however, is critical to limiting Americans' taxpayers' growing liability for existing waste. The pilot program included in the bill can move forward directly after enactment and is not linked to whether the Nuclear Regulatory Commission has issued a decision on a permanent repository. Many of us in the minority have questioned the need for Congress to intervene legislatively in the debate over Yucca Mountain at this point in time. The Trump administration has requested funding to revive the project's application and already has sufficient authority under current law to move forward on a license for a repository at that location. Most recently, it was the Senate, which failed to appropriate funding for the license to be considered. With that said, I support this bill and believe this legislation is a step in the right direction to address our nation's existing nuclear waste issues, which was reflected by the 49-4 vote the chair recognized to report the bill out of committee. However, I want to acknowledge this is an incredibly sensitive issue for many members of Congress, and I expect it will be fiercely opposed by those given members. I fully recognize the concerns of those members, which is why it is critical that this bill is being considered under a rule and not on the suspension calendar. Given those concerns, I would urge this committee to adopt an open rule. These issues should be thoroughly debated before the full House. But knowing the rarity in which bills have been considered under open rules in recent years, I would encourage the committee to make as many amendments in order as possible. I again thank you for allowing me to appear before the committee. I'm happy to answer any questions, and with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Mr. Tonko, thank you very much. Chairman Shimkus, the issues that loom about this are distinct. Money, sovereignty of a state, and that I respect. But there's also a timeline that Mr. Tonko then talked about of resolution. It's my understanding that this would allow the opening of the DOE to look at other sites. Is that correct?
What this does has a couple provisions. As the ranking member said, the current law is that Yucca Mountain is a site for the long-term repository, and that due to the lack of appropriation, the final adjudication hasn't happened, so the licensing issue. The second point is the amount of defense waste and spent nuclear fuel projected outstrips we've raised the metric ton amount in Yucca Mountain, but it outstrips the site now, and so there's always talk about needing a second geological repository in the future. What this does, as the ranking member said, was allow for interim storage sites to be first. They have to get permitted by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. They have to decide the safety of the plan, and then so you can start consolidating the spent fuel for the most part, so that then you can obviously then the amount of money that we're paying out in the judgment fund goes down, and then these communities will be able to redevelop many of the sites as they're looking forward to.
So let me see if I can continue, but I believe you did say most carefully and thoughtfully, we're paying money to store it on site.
We are paying the utilities to hold the spent fuel that by law we're obligated to hold.
And they are probably holding that on site because those sites are the only one authorized. Or are they transmitting these to other storage facilities?
There's mostly, so for spent nuclear fuel, there's very little movement. There
Right.
has been movement from one closed nuclear power plant to another one in the state.
Right.
To
But by and large,
co-locate.
they're being held on site.
There's no place for it to go.
But all I'm saying is by and large, I'm just trying
Correct.
to see if I got this right.
Right.
And so now what we're saying is if Nevada chooses not to, for some reason, whether it be the United States Senate or somebody else, then an alternative site may be selected for some temporary viewpoint. No.
What we're saying is the science of today around the world is that for final resting of spent nuclear fuel, you have to have a deep geological repository.
There's only one of those.
Well, I mean, England, Sweden,
Okay, in the
France
United
are all
States.
pursuing this type of storage. The Yucca Mountain facility has a 10-mile tunnel. It has to be, first of all, we have to have the final adjudication, and then we have to finish building out the repository. The law, this change will allow us to start consolidating into what we call interim storage sites, so that you don't. So then everyone frees up the land, really frees up the cost, because now you'll take. Remember, there's 39 states, 121 locations. So in the interim world, you could have 10 interim sites, consolidate in 10 states. So then you're freeing up 29 states from even having this issue anymore.
I gather that the aggregate of answers that come from the Nevada delegation is they are not interested in pursuing the matter. How would you characterize it?
Well, my Nevada colleagues are right behind me, so
recognize
I know where they're at for the most part, and they have not been shy about addressing that. The way I would address it is we do have the original law was written in 1982 to address this problem, and the funding for it was put on the ratepayers of those states that have nuclear power. In '87, it was amended after doing research on a lot of different locations to, we need to move, let's look at Nevada. Now, Nevada, 90% of the land is owned by the federal government, and most of the land in this area is federal government land. So they would reject my characterization. All we're trying to do is comply with the law and get away from the fees that we have to pay, safely gather, and then safely have a final repository so that, this whole thing goes back to World War II. I mean, this is a historic debate, and really the question is, and we're not even really talking much about the defense waste that one of your colleagues knows very well. Do we want to have 39 locations in 39 states, 121 locations, or do we want to have 3 or 4 interim sites and a long-term geological repository? That's kind of really the basis of the debate.
Well, I get it. Mr. Collins? Gentleman does not seek time. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Yeah, as I mentioned, I have some concerns with the bill, but I just hope that you'll be open to make as many amendments in order as possible. And with that, I yield back. I have no further
Gentleman
questions.
yields back his time. Thank you very much. Distinguished gentleman from Alabama. Gentleman does not seek time. Distinguished gentleman from Florida.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I do have a few questions, but I will have an opportunity to manage this rule on the floor, so I'll try to be brief. Let me ask either of you, but I'll start with Mr. Tonko. The inventory of spent fuel in the United States is reported to be 72,000 metric tons. Can you all describe where and how this waste is currently stored?
Basically, as was indicated, primarily at the reactor sites.
Okay, so you have 121 sites, several of them indicating that they're getting ready to close. Approximately how many of them store waste on site?
I would think a great majority.
They all have waste on site.
All right. And at what point does the system become unsafe?
I think if holding spent nuclear fuel, remember there's 2 components to this. One is spent nuclear fuel, one's defense waste. So on the spent nuclear fuel, I'd be the first one to say that at the location where they are right now, it's safe. I'm not saying that it's not safe, but the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which is our independent safety agency, they say it's only safe for a short amount of time. So having that, so what do you want to do for thousands and 10,000 to 100,000s of years? And that's where when we talk about long-term geological repository. So the safety and evaluation report offered by the NRC, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, said if we move forward as planned, spent nuclear fuel and defense waste will be safely stored in the Yucca Mountain Repository for over 1 million years.
Really?
That's their safety and evaluation report. Now, with my...
John, how much research, how much science is involved in this particular matter?
$15 billion worth is what we spent to do this. The first time that I visited the site, it was still an operating site, and with engineers and people walking all around and testing things that I didn't even know they would be testing. One example I always talk about is in the tunnel, they had like a big blast furnace, and all they were doing was heating the rock, like for years, to see what would happen. I don't think anyone would dispute the fact that this is the most studied piece of property in the world. So that's what finally the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, again, our safety experts, they did the evaluation of all the data, and that's what the conclusion they came to.
Well, now, Nevada, Las Vegas is about 100 miles from this site.
Correct.
Ms. Rosen and I were just having a conversation, not so much about this particular legislation, but I mentioned to her Kilauea, the volcano erupting and the geological consequences, earthquakes every hour, and the ripple effect. I guess if I lived in Sun City or in Las Vegas, I would be worried about earthquakes and other matters of that kind. What's your response?
Yeah, I think that, and Paul, you can jump in anytime you want, but I would think some of the benefit we've had is the support from some California colleagues, and a lot of them are
Yeah, you have some of them on the
Well,
fault line.
exactly.
With the nuclear plants, I don't understand how the hell they were built like that in the first place.
So they have numerous nuclear power plants on, quote unquote, the Ring of Fire, and they have a concern. And I think that has pushed them to decide to be supportive. And again, and they are from states that have nuclear power, so they've paid into this fund to have a final disposition and a final plan. And so they've been very helpful in the 49-4 vote. It was raised by Mr. Tonko that Doris Matsui offered the interim language, and that was very helpful in moving the bill forward.
All right. I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman Florida yields back. Gentleman from Colorado. Seek time? That'd be you, Ken. You seek time?
Yes, please.
Then you're recognized.
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank you for this bill and your efforts. I have to tell you, I actually moved to Colorado to the U.S. Attorney's Office to work on the Rocky Flats prosecution. Rocky Flats prosecution occurred because the Department of Defense was asking the contractor, Rockwell, to produce more nuclear triggers. The Department of Energy was working with the Department of Defense, and there was nowhere to dispose of the nuclear waste. So it was stored on site. It was stored improperly, and it resulted in environmental damage because it was being stored with concrete out in the open. I don't really care where the solution is, but there has to be a solution in this country to help with our energy problems, and I very much appreciate you two gentlemen doing this and pushing this and helping us with this effort. So thank you very much. I truly believe that nuclear energy is one of the energy sources that we need in this mix, and I really appreciate the fact that you're doing this bill. So thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Colorado. Seek time? That'd be you. Okay. Gentle lady from California. Okay. Gentle lady's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for bringing this bill before us. It is my understanding that Yucca Mountain is 100 miles northwest of Vegas, but approximately, according to Google Maps, 60 miles from the rare earth mine that is on the California side near Barstow. Will this site have any impact on the future mining abilities of that?
The only time we talked about future mining aspects was in the development of a transportation network that could obviously go close to that mining operation so that then they would have access to rail. So it was, the only time we had a comment on mining was the positive aspects that this could aid in the development of that.
Okay, because the rare earth mine is such a special place. There are only 2 in the world, and we want to make sure that whatever is built, even in the neighborhood within 60 miles, is not going to compromise our future use of that facility.
Again, no, I mean, we can follow up with you, but the only discussions that were ever about was that in mining operations, it's a bulk commodity. You need rail as the best way to move bulk commodities, and it was always with respect to siting.
Okay.
Could this be helpful in the, obviously the extraction, the removal of those metals on a rail operation?
If your staff has any additional information, I would appreciate
Yes, ma'am.
that. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Gentlelady from home. No questions. That seems to be all the questions for this panel. This panel is thanked and is dismissed. Mr. Chair, anything else you need to add, Mr. Hawkins?
Yeah, if I might just congratulate Mr. McGovern on his advancement with the committee, and Congresswoman Torres, congratulations on your addition to the Rules Committee. And with that, again, I thank you for the opportunity today.
All right, thank you. All right, the chair now calls to the table Mr. Lujan, Ms. Capiter, Ms. Titus, Ms. Rosen, and Mr. Amadei, and Mr. Ken. You gonna do all of them? Mr. Kewen as well, yes. Is Mr. Lujan gonna be joining us?
Scoot down a little bit, Marcy, let Mark pull in here. No. Okay.
Come on in, Mark.
Welcome, everyone, to the Rules Committee. Glad to see everyone. There seems to be a common theme of this table as we go, except for the gentlelady from Ohio, but I think there's probably a common theme developing here. So with that, the chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Ohio, and we'll just continue from there.
Turn the mic for there. Oh, there. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. And members of the committee, as perhaps others have said, I feel a sense of gratitude and loss as I come into this room for the first time without Congresswoman Louise Slaughter of New York being here. I can feel her presence and sense her, and we thank her and her family and her constituents for sending her to this Congress for so many years of honorable service.
We agree with that, and just looking up at her picture, watching over us, and thinking of rhubarb pie makes us all feel better.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member McGovern, and members of this distinguished committee. The bill that we are considering here today addresses the need to deal with nuclear waste, which is scattered at dozens of nuclear sites across our country. And increasingly, these sites will no longer have active nuclear power plants, or at least a large subset of them. And all that remains locally is a shuttered plant and radioactive waste. I'm here today to defend an equally significant dimension of nuclear power capabilities, and that is the human and community casualties that result from the closure of these plants. And I beg your attention, as the Rules Committee, to a more reasonable adjustment glide path for impacted communities and people who live and work there. Let me mention that for the Great Lakes region, we have no energy umbrella like the Bureau of Reclamation in the West or the Tennessee Valley Authority in portions of the South. The impact on local economies due to the potential loss of nuclear-related jobs and the tax base when nuclear power plants close can indeed be severe. For example, in my district, a plant called Davis-Besse, a 900-megawatt plant that produces nuclear power, will, if it were to close, would mean the loss of a direct 700 highly paid, skilled nuclear industry workers, and for every 100 nuclear power plant jobs, 66 related jobs created in the local community. That's an additional 500 jobs. These plants are among the largest taxpayers in their communities, typically contributing tens of millions of dollars in local taxes. So for years, in fact, each year, the Davis-Besse plant in my district in a rural county generates $20 million in tax revenue for Ottawa County, of which $12.1 million goes to its school district. Let me be clear. We do not wish to give up on Davis-Besse, nor should we easily give up on other nuclear power plants around our country. Nuclear power provides the largest majority of clean energy in this country. And from a national security perspective, we must consider the impact of the anticipated closure on our nation's nuclear supply chain, which absolutely includes its highly trained people and specialized technologies. Our amendment proposes to offer community adjustment support to soften the blow of the significant revenue losses that will harm the immediate community and its workers by infusing federal payments on a gliding path over 8 years to eligible local governments should the worst happen. The funding would provide 80% of the lost revenues during the first year, decreasing by 10% per year for the remaining years of eligibility. The other massive burden on local communities results from spent nuclear fuel that will remain on site. Unfortunately, nuclear waste on these sites is stranded around our country due to what's been talked about here earlier today. We don't have a permanent disposal site. So due to this federal failure, these local communities cannot clean up the impacted sites and transform them into some other useful purpose. Indeed, in the case of Davis-Besse, it's on a beautiful site along Lake Erie's freshwater south coast in close proximity to several thousand acres of state and federal parks and reserves, destinations which at this moment are overrun by tourists every year. It is simply one of the best birding, boating, and fishing locations in the world and a primary migratory path for North American songbirds. The site could easily be converted to increase lodging and recreation, and instead the local community and government will be stuck overseeing major deposits of nuclear waste, no tax revenue, and struggling schools. Ohioans don't give up. It is our history, and during the Battle of Lake Erie, Commander Oliver Hazard Perry, and I know, Mr. Chairman, you're in the Air Force, but in any case, he memorialized at Perry's Monument, just a few miles from Davis-Besse, and unfurled a flag that read, "Don't give up the ship." Well, we're not giving up, and we plan to keep fighting for the community and those impacted by the future of Davis-Besse. In closing, if the worst happens, I urge my colleagues to consider my amendment or some amended version of it for communities such as this, to consider the toll that these closures will exert on communities, schools, roads, law enforcement, and other fundamental civil services that people need will be gutted. This is not an isolated problem facing the people of Northern Ohio. Dozens of other communities are facing the prospect of closures of plants across this nation. The closure of these plants affects more than the plant itself. We owe our people our best effort to provide a pathway for recovery should the worst happen. Thank you so much.
Thank you, the gentlelady. Appreciate it. And also just a reminder to all witnesses, if you have written testimony, please make sure that the stenographer has that. And the chair now recognizes someone who got here very early and has been waiting for a while. Ms. Rosen, you're now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Ranking Member McGovern, members of the committee, and I really appreciate the opportunity to testify to today's hearing. I stand with the overwhelming majority of Nevadans who wholeheartedly oppose our state becoming the dumping ground for the rest of the nation's nuclear waste. In 1987, Congress amended the Nuclear Waste Policy Act and targeted Yucca Mountain, located less than 100 miles northwest of Las Vegas, as the sole site to be our nation's nuclear waste repository. For more than 3 decades, the state of Nevada has rejected this project on safety grounds, public health concerns, and environmental concerns, citing numerous scientific studies. Based on DOE's own studies, Yucca Mountain is unfit as a repository site for nuclear waste because of the impact it would have on national transportation. We're talking about transporting tens of thousands of metric tons of radioactive waste. That would require shipping up to 3 loads per week of highly radioactive waste to Nevada by rail or truck would take over 50 years. Deadly waste that would go through 329 congressional districts across this country, including every single district of every member on this Rules Committee. I'd like to submit some maps into the record, please, that show the routes. Thank you. So I just want to reiterate that. If this bill passes, nuclear waste could be transported through the district of every member of this committee. One radiological release, whether it's accidental or intentional, could directly affect your constituents and your families. One single moment of exposure could cripple our communities, your communities, for generations to come. And let me be clear, these routes, they are not secret. Any number of bad actors will know exactly when and where to target each and every one of these shipments. To the members here today representing these districts, I ask you this: do you consent to high-level radioactive waste barreling down your highways or train tracks? And most importantly, are you prepared to face your constituents at home and tell them that you voted to put their safety at risk? The Yucca Mountain project would also jeopardize our national security and the readiness of our Air Force by compromising military activities at the Nevada Test and Training Range, the largest air and ground military training space in the contiguous United States. I ask to submit a map of Nevada to show all the DOD and DOE assets. Thank you. So I ask you today, why double down on a project we all know will fail? Instead of spending billions more in hard-earned taxpayer dollars on this reckless and costly project that will put families in your districts at risk, let's work on converting the site into something that will keep all of our families safe and still create jobs. My bill, the Jobs Not Waste Act, which I filed as an amendment to H.R. 3053, is a proactive and innovative proposal to turn Yucca Mountain into something useful, a project to create jobs without threatening the health and safety of Nevadans and other Americans across the country. This amendment would prohibit the Department of Energy from moving forward with its current plan until the federal government considers a number of other job-creating alternatives for Yucca Mountain. These alternative purposes could be defense activities, like a command facility for unmanned aircraft systems, scientific research, the development of a secure electronic data center, or renewable energy generation. So, Mr. Chairman, it's time to face the facts. Yucca Mountain is a failed project, and continuing down this path will not only waste time and taxpayer money. The underlying bill, H.R. 3053, ignores the environmental, safety, and security concerns of Nevadans who will be forced to store nuclear waste in their state without their consent. We need forward-thinking solutions to tackle this issue, and my amendment would help us turn the site into something that will create jobs while also protecting the families across this country, Nevada's families, and our tourism industry. I appreciate the ability to testify here today and strongly urge this committee to do what's right for the health and safety of our constituents and what is fiscally responsible by making my amendment in order. Thank you.
Thank the gentlelady. Now the gentlelady from Nevada, Ms. Titus, is recognized.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've been here many times, have offered many amendments. They've never been put in order. But like Ohio, I do not give up, so I'm back.
The Georgia is coming out in. Albany.
Before I give my testimony, though, I'd like to correct the record on a couple of things that were said by Mr. Shimkus. He says that Europe is looking at this kind of storage. Most of Europe does reprocessing. They have breeder reactors. It's a whole different kind of system, so that's not really accurate either. Also, all the members of California who live along the San Andreas Fault are not supportive of this. Mike Thompson has spoken against it on several occasions. You keep talking about 131, 132 sites. As was pointed out, this goes through 329 districts.
Gentlelady Yield, so check your mic. They're undoubtedly saying it's not on.
Thank you.
There we go.
Also, it has been pointed out that $15 billion has already been spent on this. What's going to cost 80 to 100 billion more to bring it up to speed and complete it. So I would just ask you to keep those facts in mind. So now I'd like to address my amendment to this Nuclear Waste Policy Act. As you know, I've said many times before this committee, it's a flawed piece of legislation that doubles down on fake science and bad politics. When I testified before the Energy and Commerce Committee, when it was first introduced last year, we presented the map that shows all the districts where it will travel, and we pointed out some of the many problems of the legislation. I'm not going to run through the technical problems again, you've all heard of them, but one that is especially important to mention is that this bill increases the allowable amount of highly radioactive nuclear waste that would be put at Yucca Mountain by 37%. 37% above the levels that were authorized in the original law. And when we ask about the original law and this law, and Mr. Shimka says, oh, well, it might let some other places. No, this law is only about Nevada and only about Yucca Mountain. In addition to the fact that there's 37% more allowed, all these environmental impact studies that have been quoted are based not on the 37% increase, but on the original figure that would be allowed there. That includes a 5-volume safety evaluation report and other impact studies about the environment. So was this decision based on science? No. Was this decision based on Nevada raising its hand and say, yeah, we want it, like Mr. Sessions said before, yeah, Texas will take it, fine. Let Texas take it. Nevada didn't raise their hand and said, we want it. This was a bad political decision, plain and simple. So my amendment gets to the root of the problem. It's not more studies, it's not more looking at it, it's not pushing it down the road. It gets to the root of the problem. If we'd done this initially, we wouldn't have been spinning our wheels for the last 36 years and spending $15 billion. What this does is acts as a substitute to put into place consent-based approach to the siting decision. This was the recommendation from the Blue Ribbon Commission. This is the way to go. This is included in the bill when it comes to interim storage, requiring consent-based to site interim storage. Why is it good enough for interim storage and it's not good enough for permanent storage? If you had everybody at the table, you based it on consent, then it would have been solved many, many years ago. I would just say that New Mexico has expressed an interest, Texas has expressed an interest. This problem could be solved if you go with consent-based. So these states have even filed, I would point out, requests with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, but they've been ignored because this train is going towards Yucca Mountain. I would say take a look at the desire from these other states and make the decision based on that. So this amendment would solve the problem once and for all. We can move down the road. We can find out the best place and the best way to store the waste. Right now, Yucca Mountain, you've heard all the bad science. It's gone from being, is this a safe place, to how to make it a safer place. Those are two very different questions and two very different goals. So I would ask you to consider this amendment for the record. I would also like to enter into the record, if you don't mind, Mr. Chairman, letters from League of Conservation Voters, American Gaming Association, Las Vegas Chamber of Commerce, Las Vegas Convention Center, City of Las Vegas, American Gaming, and over 100 safety and environmental groups who have written in support of my legislation.
Without objection, those will be entered in the record.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Gentleman from Nevada, Mr. You ready? Are you ready? Mr. Amadei is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For your record, Mark Amadei, representing Congressional District 2 in Nevada. I'll attempt to make this pretty simple. If you're planning on not voting for any of the amendments that have been offered or will be offered here, but you are planning on voting for the bill, I'd like you to consider some stuff. And that is this. As my colleagues have made clear, and Mr. Shimkus has made clear, and Mr. Tomko has made clear, this is only Nevada, and it's only about Yucca Mountain. So this amendment's got some stuff in there that, guess what? It's about Nevada, and it's about Yucca Mountain. And it says, if the vote on the floor, without adopting any of these other amendments, is to adopt the bill, This amendment is aimed at that type of situation. Only about Nevada and only about Yucca Mountain. Reprocessing. As my colleague from District 1 very eloquently stated, it's like there's an increase of 37%. That's a lot of bulk. It takes a long time, as my other colleague said, to get it all there. Well, guess what? If you're going to do all that and you're going to increase that and vote for the bill, then we really ought to be talking about reprocessing research. Guess what else? There's already reprocessing research going on at UNLV, near the site, within 100 miles northwest. And so if we're going to talk about putting it there, as Mr. Shimkus said, for lots and lots of time, we probably ought to invest in how to minimize that bulk and turn as much of it into recycling instead of just, quite frankly, nuclear landfill. Guess what else the amendment does? It says that if you're going to do that, and this is about Nevada and it's about Yucca Mountain, that we really ought to talk about who's going to have oversight in terms of operational control to make sure environmental and safety things are done right. Guess what? There's a world-class, reputable scientific outfit called the Desert Research Institute. It's located in Nevada. Now, you'll see language in this that is not, I know you're going to earmark, it's not an earmark, but it says if you're going to do this only in Nevada and only in Yucca Mountain, then guess what? You ought to have the home team doing the oversight to make sure we're following the rules. So it gives them a preference, just like it does the other organization at UNLV that's doing reprocessing research. A couple other things. If it's only going to be in Nevada and it's only going to be at Yucca Mountain, there are some safety things that, quite frankly, are safety things. If we're going to deal with an issue comprehensively, we need a coordinator in case there's a nuclear accident. And so it talks about safety for those people that are hosting this material. Another one that, quite frankly, I know the parliamentarian's an excellent person, but they said, hey, you've got something in there about a highway designation. Not around the project itself, but it starts for planning purposes, since I don't believe anything in this legislation talks about flying the stuff in, that it's either going to be by rail or by surface transportation in large trucks. Well, guess what? If we're going to do that, and it's going to be for tens of thousands of years, we probably ought to slowly, not real near the facility proposed, start talking about where highways are going to be. So when somebody says, oh, that's not germane, that's a highway thing, it's like, I got news for you. If we were flying it in, somebody would be talking about an airport. So with all due respect to that small provision in terms of germaneness, it's probably appropriate and responsible to talk about surface transportation, at least in a beginning baby step sense. And finally, I will tell you this. When we talk about sending nuclear waste to Nevada, there's actually, as some of you have in your districts of history, there's a building in Nevada that, as a result of experiments that were done in the 20s, is contaminated with radium. And so, as we talk about the billions and billions of dollars, it is appropriate to say, oh, by the way, if we're going to send this to that state in a highly regulated sense, we probably ought to clean up that 90-year-old mess that's in a small part. And you say, well, it's a building. It's a historical building. It's on a university campus. And so you will see that in there also. No problem with germaneness there. So I would say to you, if you're not going to do a study, if you're not going to walk away from the site at all, if you want to show some responsibility in terms of reprocessing, who's in charge of watching that there's compliance, if you want to talk about safety for people that are there, and you want to talk about advanced planning for how transportation is going to flow through that whole part of the state, which is a very large area, and if you want to clean up a 90-year-old mess that, quite frankly, the federal government's responsible for, then I would urge you to support this amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Nevada, Ms. Kennedy, recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ranking Member McGovern and committee. First of all, I represent the 4th Congressional District, which is where Yucca Mountain resides. In 1987, Nevada was targeted as our nation's nuclear waste dumped through the Screw Nevada bill. In the 30 years since this bill passed, Congress has wasted $3.7 billion of taxpayer money. Now, some of my colleagues want to continue to egregiously spend money on a project that my constituents and the majority of Nevadans do not want. This is why I introduced an amendment that would get rid of the ability to have appropriations offset by nuclear waste fee collections, also known as the waste fund. When drafting this bill, my colleagues created a budget gimmick that would make it easier to fund this proposed project by not doing an actual offset. For my colleagues who always talk about need to reduce the debt and deficit, this should support my amendment and have real appropriations that follow pay-go rules. In addition, this amendment would require that any funds appropriated to Yucca Mountain Nuclear Waste Repository be treated as a discretionary appropriations. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment and make sure that this budget gimmick is not included on the bill. Mr. Chairman, I have been to Yucca Mountain. I visited Yucca Mountain a few months ago, and I have driven through the desert that is home to bighorn sheep, desert tortoise, and ancient petroglyphs. It is clear that reopening Yucca Mountain threatens the health and safety of Nevadans and Americans from across the country. My home state of Nevada, which has no nuclear energy producing facilities, should not be the dumping ground for the rest of the country's nuclear waste. I have grave concerns with the transportation of nuclear waste to Yucca Mountain should this project continue against the will of my constituents and Nevadans. That is why I have also offered an amendment that would authorize grants to the state of Nevada and affected local governments to conduct socioeconomic studies on the economic burden that the state of Nevada would face by having the nation's first high-level nuclear waste repository. Nevadans deserve to know if our state has adequate resources to deal with the influx of nuclear waste and nuclear workers into our state. Can our schools handle the influx of children? What impact will transporting this waste have on Nevada's highways, roads, and bridges? Does Nevada have adequate emergency services? Nevadans need answers. The state of Nevada has already conducted many of these studies on a wide range of topics, from quality of life costs to rural community impacts to the impact of Native Americans. However, these studies are decades old and don't account for the rapid change the state of Nevada has experienced. At the time of these studies were done, the population of Nevada was approximately 1.5 million people. Now, the state has doubled in size with a population of nearly 3 million people. In fact, these studies are so outdated that my congressional district, the 4th Congressional District, did not even exist, nor did the district of my esteemed colleague, Jackie Rosens, did. So for such important issue to the state, we must rely upon data that accurately reflects the current situation in Nevada so that we can see the impacts the proposed nuclear site will have. We need to know what the strain would be on our state, and that is why I encourage my colleagues to support my amendment. And make no mistake, Mr. Chairman, this is non-negotiable. Over 80% of Nevadans oppose bringing nuclear waste to the state of Nevada, and I hope that you listen to the concerns of my constituents. Because at the end of the day, if this was in your district, I'm pretty sure you wouldn't want it in your backyard.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. McGovern. But before you start, votes have been called, so if you want to go in and out, we'll do that. But,
I support making all your amendments in order, and I would just like to ask unanimous consent to insert in the record a statement from Mr. Lujan.
without objection, that is ordered.
I yield
Hear the
back.
record. Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Georgia. No questions. No questions. At this point, seeing no other questions, the panel is dismissed. Thank you. If you have your prepared notes, please leave those for the stenographer on your way out. Thank you for your participation. What are we going to do? Committee stands in recess, subject to the call of the chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move the committee grant H.R. 3053, the Nuclear Waste Policy Amendments Act of 2018, a structured rule. The rule provides 1 hour of general debate equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Energy and Commerce. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule makes an order as original text for the purpose of amendment and an amendment in the nature of a substitute consisting of the text of Rules Committee Print 115-69 and provides that it shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against that amendment in the nature of a substitute, and the rule makes in order only those further amendments printed in the Rules Committee report. Each such amendment may be offered only in the order printed in the report, may be offered only by a member designated in the report, and shall be considered as read. Shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and an opponent, shall not be subject to amendment, and shall not be subject to a demand for the division of the question. The rule waives all points of order against the amendments printed in the report, and finally, the rule provides one motion to recommit with or without instructions.
Hearing the motion from the gentleman from Georgia, any discussion or amendment?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from Massachusetts.
I have an amendment to the rule. I move the committee make an order and give the necessary waivers for the amendment to H.R. 3053 by Representative Rosen, number 1, which will prohibit any action relating to the licensing, planning, development, or construction of a nuclear waste repository at the Yucca Mountain site until the Director of the Office of Management and Budget studies the economic viability and job-creating benefits of alternative uses of the site.
Upon hearing the motion from the gentleman from Massachusetts, are there any discussion? Hearing no discussion, the motion is on the, vote is on the amendment by the motion man from the ranking member. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, no. No. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
That's a recorded vote, Mr.
There'll be a roll call vote. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Cole, Mr. Woodall. Mr. Woodall, no. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Sessions. Mr. Sessions, no. Mr. Byrne. Mr. Byrne, no. Mr. Newhouse. Mr. Newhouse, no. Mr. Buck. Mr. Buck, no. Ms. Cheney. Ms. Cheney, no. Mr. McGovern.
Aye.
Mr. McGovern, aye. Mr. Hastings. Mr. Hastings, aye. Mr. Polis. Mr. Polis, aye. Mrs. Torres. Mrs. Torres, aye. Mr. Chairman. No. Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk reports total.
4 yeas, 7 nays.
7 nays, 4 ayes. The amendment is not adopted. Are there any more discussions or amendments? Hearing no other motions, the vote is now on the motion from the gentleman from Georgia. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no.
No.
Opinion of the chair, the ayes have
Ask
it.
for a roll call, Mr. Chairman.
Roll call. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Cole. Mr. Woodall. Aye. Mr. Woodall, aye. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Sessions. Mr. Sessions, aye. Mr. Byrne. Mr. Byrne, aye. Mr. Newhouse. Mr. Newhouse, aye. Mr. Buck. Mr. Buck, aye. Ms. Cheney. Ms. Cheney, aye. Mr. McGovern.
No.
Mr. McGovern, no. Mr. Hastings.
No.
Mr. Hastings, no. Mr. Polis. Mr. Polis, no. Mrs. Torres. Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, aye. 7
Clerk
yeas,
report roll.
7 yeas, 4 nays.
The amendment is adopted and so ordered. The manager for our side will be Mr. Newhouse, and from your side?
Mr. Hastings of Florida will manage.
Mr. Hastings of Florida. At that point, are hearing any other business before the committee?
Are we meeting again this week?
We are not meeting again this week. This is the last meeting of the week. It has been so good to see all of your lovely faces. Put in a special request. We'll do that.
And it is, the chairman had mentioned that we expect the Farm Bill next week. Do we have a day when we might deal with it?
The chair now recognizes the chairman, since it was the chairman's.
Thank you very much, and I do appreciate the gentleman asking, because each of us are spending a great deal of time preparing. There will be a dialogue that will take place between Mr. Hoyer and Mr. McCarthy that will take place on the floor, and that's when the schedule will be set for next week. And that will take place, today is today Wednesday? Today's Tuesday. That will take place on Thursday, and there will be an announcement by the majority leader at that time.
And is it possible that we might deal with it in the committee on Monday? Or Tuesday?
There would be, I expect that we will return on Tuesday, but once again, the majority leader is going to make an announcement about this. As you know, we have NDAA, we have the Farm Bill, we have several different matters that are going to come before the committee, and the sequencing of that has not been determined yet. And so because of that sequencing. What I can tell the committee is that you would anticipate, I would anticipate that you're receiving a great deal of input and interest on both these bills.
So we'll do something next week.
Well, we're going to be busy doing important matters once again before the Rules Committee. I thank the chairman for allowing me a chance to
Yeah, gentlemen,
proceed.
any more discussion or questions of the committee? Committee now stands adjourned.